Welcome to the dark past. Tonight, story is about two women they laughed at, until 50 bounty hunters could not catch them. Before we begin, tell me in the comments which country you are watching from and what time it is there right now. On the edge of the Mississippi lowlands, where the river breathed mist into the morning air and the soil stained hands the color of rust, the plantation stood like a monument to ownership. Fields stretched wide beneath a punishing sun. Rows of cotton and cane swayed in disciplined lines, just like the people forced to tend them. Among those people were Hannah and Ruth. They were cousins by blood, though slavery had blurred family lines into something both fragile and fierce. Hannah was older by 3 years, broad across the shoulders with arms shaped by years of lifting bundles heavier than most men cared to carry. Ruth was shorter but wider in frame, her strength centered low, steady as a tree trunk planted deep into earth. Together, they were assigned the hardest labor, hauling sacks, clearing brush, dragging timber. The overseer liked to joke about them. "Too big to run," he would say, laughing as he wiped sweat from his neck. "If they try, we'll hear them coming from miles away." The white men around him would laugh too. Laughter was easy when you believed you owned the ending of someone else's story. But Hannah and Ruth did not laugh. They listened. Mockery can be a weapon. It can also be camouflage. When people underestimate you, they stop watching closely. They assume your limits. They measure your strength only by what they understand. The plantation operated on routine. Bells rang before sunrise, work lines formed, tools were distributed. At dusk, bodies returned to quarters under watchful eyes. Patrols rotated at predictable intervals. Dogs were kenneled near the barn after nightfall, fed and restless but not always alert during storms. Hannah noticed these details first. Ruth remembered them. For months, they spoke little of escape. The word itself felt dangerous, like striking flint near dry grass. But planning does not always require speech. It requires memory, observation, patience. In the quarters at night, when exhaustion pulled others quickly into sleep, Hannah would lie awake listening to distant hoofbeats on patrol routes. She counted the seconds between passes. She marked which guards smoked near the fence line, and which preferred shelter when clouds gathered. She noted how rain softened soil and erased prints by morning. Ruth gathered small things. An extra strip of dried corn tucked into cloth, a nail fallen from a broken crate, a scrap of twine, a tin cup dented but usable. She stored them in a loose board beneath the floor. Not because she knew exactly when they would run, but because survival favors preparation over hope. They were not the only ones who dreamed of freedom. Whispers moved through the quarters like one through grass, but most dreams died under the weight of fear. Bounties were rising across counties. Notices were nailed to posts in nearby towns offering reward money for captured escapees. Professional slave huntersmen who tracked humans for profit had begun moving through the region more frequently. $50 for one person, more if returned alive and uninjured. Money sharpened pursuit. Hannah understood something crucial. Speed would not save them. They were not built for sudden sprints across open land. But endurance that was different. They could work from dawn to dusk without collapse. They could carry weight for miles. They could move steadily long after others tired. If they left, they would not run like deer. They would walk like the river, slow, deliberate, unstoppable. The opportunity came wrapped in thunder. Summer storms along the Mississippi arrived with violence. Clouds stacked high and dark by late afternoon. Wind bent crops sideways. Rain fell heavy enough to blur vision. Guards sought shelter. Dogs whimpered and pulled against chains. That night, as lightning cracked open the sky and rain hammered tin roofs, Hannah reached beneath the floorboard and retrieved the small bundle Ruth had prepared. No dramatic words were spoken. No tearful goodbyes. Too much emotion invites hesitation. They stepped outside when the next thunderclap shook the air. Mud swallowed their footprints almost instantly. Rain erased the direction of travel. They did not head straight into dense forest. That would be expected. Instead, they moved first along the outer fence line, staying low, letting the storm mask sound. When they reached a shallow drainage ditch swollen with runoff, they stepped into the water and followed its course north. Cold water numbed their legs. Debris scraped against skin. But moving within water confuses dogs. It breaks scent trails. By the time the storm lessened near dawn, they had already covered more ground than anyone would assume possible for two women considered too heavy. Morning revealed absence. At roll call, their names were called once. Then again, overseer boots thudded across mud toward the quarters. Boards were kicked aside. Faces were searched for knowledge. Within hours, riders were dispatched to neighboring towns. Notices were written. Descriptions exaggerated. 2 large Negro women, strong build, likely heading north, dangerous if cornered. By afternoon, bounty hunters began assembling. They came in groups, some professionals, others opportunists drawn by reward money, rifles slung over shoulders, dogs straining at leashes, horses restless, men confident. 2 of them. One hunter reportedly scoffed, 1 to make it 3 days. Confidence can be blinding. Meanwhile, Hannah and Ruth rested beneath a fallen tree deep within a patch of woods that most locals avoided due to uneven ground. They did not speak much. Energy conserved is energy saved for later. Ruth unwrapped a small portion of corn. They ate slowly, drank rainwater collected in leaves. By nightfall, they moved again. Their strategy was simple but disciplined. Travel at night, rest before sunrise. Avoid open roads. Cross streams whenever possible. Double back occasionally to create confusion. Use their strength to push through thicker undergrowth where lighter bodies might pass but leave clearer traces. On the second night, they reached swampy terrain. Mosquitoes swarmed, mud sucked at ankles. Many would avoid such ground out of fear of sinking, but Hannah tested each step with a long branch. Ruth followed in rhythm, placing her feet where Hannah had compressed soil first. Their combined weight, distributed carefully, allowed them to cross areas others might assume impassable. Behind them, the hunters fanned outward. Dogs picked up faint scent near the drainage ditch, but lost clarity after heavy rain. Arguments broke out quickly among the men regarding direction. Some believed the women would head toward known abolitionist routes. Others insisted they would remain nearby, too slow to travel far. The search expanded. 50 hunters moving across terrain leave marks. Broken twigs, campfires, horse tracks, noise. Hannah noticed this by the 3rd night. From a ridge overlooking a shallow clearing, she saw torchlight flickering in the distance. They were being hunted not by a single tracker, but by a force large enough to disrupt the forest itself. Ruth felt fear then, not panic but awareness of scale. Too many, she whispered. Hannah shook her head slowly. Too loud. Large groups struggle with silence. Coordination requires communication. Communication makes sound. That night, they adjusted direction, moving toward denser swamp, where horses could not follow easily. It was a gamble, but so was everything else. On the 4th day, one group of hunters believed they had cornered the women near a narrow stretch of wooded high ground bordered by water on 2 sides. They set up camp, confident escape routes were limited. Hannah and Ruth watched from deeper shadow. The hunters built a perimeter fire, assuming the women would attempt to pass under cover of darkness. Dogs were staked near the center. Men drank and laughed, already imagining reward money in their hands. Hannah studied the wind. When it shifted slightly toward the camp, she nodded to Ruth. Using the nail from their small bundle and dry bark collected earlier, they sparked a small fire far from their actual path, positioning it where wind would carry smoke toward the hunters. Horses. Within minutes, shouts erupted. Horses panicked first, sensing flame before men fully saw it. Dogs barked wildly. Hunters scrambled to control animals and stamp out, spreading sparks. In chaos, perimeter discipline collapsed. Hannah and Ruth moved in the opposite direction, stepping quietly through shallow water, vanishing into darkness while men cursed smoke and confusion. By dawn, the hunters realized they had been outmaneuvered. Embarrassment spread quickly, pride wounded. But the chase intensified. Word spread further across counties, 2 big women making fools of grown men. Some hunters joined simply to avoid being mocked for staying behind. By the end of the 1st week, the search radius had expanded significantly, yet Hannah and Ruth remained unbroken. They were tired, yes, feet blistered, shoulders sore, but their breathing remained steady. Years of forced labor had prepared them for sustained hardship. What the hunters did not understand was this: suffering endured without choice becomes training when applied with purpose. Every insult ever thrown at them now fueled movement. Every laugh now echoed as motivation. On the 8th night, as they rested beneath cypress trees, Ruth finally spoke what lingered between them. They think we weak. Hannah allowed herself the smallest smile. Let them. Somewhere miles away, bounty hunters argued over maps and directions. Supplies were thinning. Horses required rest. Men unused to swamp humidity grew irritable. The chase had shifted from simple retrieval to contest of wills, and the hunters were slowly realizing something unsettling. These women were not stumbling blindly through fear, they were thinking. They were choosing terrain. They were conserving strength. They were patient. The first week ended without capture. The plantation owner grew angry. Reward money increased. Pressure mounted. But Hannah and Ruth had already moved beyond the predictable circle of pursuit. They were heading toward more difficult ground, places few hunters knew well, and though exhaustion pressed heavily upon their bodies, something else carried them forward, not speed, not luck, but unity. Two women the world called too big. Two women underestimated. Two women who understood that survival is not about how fast you begin. It is about how long you can continue, and the hunt had only just begun. The second week began with silence thick as fog. Hannah woke before the light shifted through the trees. For a moment she did not remember where they were. The forest changes each night. Shadows rearrange themselves. The mind drifts between fear and memory. Then she felt the damp earth beneath her palms and heard Ruth, steady breathing beside her, and the truth returned all at once. They were still free, and they were still being hunted. Ruth opened her eyes slowly. No words were needed. They had grown used to speaking in glances, in small movements of the chin, in the rhythm of shared breath. Talking wastes moisture. Talking wastes time. They moved before sunrise. The swamp thickened ahead, cypress knees rising like jagged teeth from black water. Mist clung low to the surface, swallowing distance. This was not land most men chose to cross willingly, but Hannah saw advantage where others saw discomfort. They stepped into water without hesitation. Cold mud climbed to their calves. The suction threatened to pull sandals loose. Ruth tightened the strips of cloth around her feet and followed Hannah. S pace, slow, deliberate, never jerking free too quickly. Panic makes you sink deeper. Control lets you rise. Behind them, far enough to be faint but close enough to matter, came the distant sound of dogs. Not one. Several. The bounty hunters had regrouped. After the embarrassment of the fire diversion, the men had tightened discipline. They began spreading out in smaller teams, covering more ground with less noise. Word had come from the plantation owner himself, double payment if the women were captured before the month ended. Pride mixed with greed is a dangerous combination, but the hunters had a weakness they did not recognize. They believed the women were reacting. In truth, Hannah and Ruth were anticipating. The swamp crossing lasted hours. By midday their legs trembled with effort, but they did not leave the water until they reached a fallen tree bridging toward higher ground. Only then did they climb out, using bark for traction. Ruth knelt, pressing her palm against the mud where they exited. She smoothed it carefully with a branch, disguising the imprint of their climb. Years of watching field hands cover mistakes had taught her the value of erasing signs. They rested briefly, sharing the last of the dried corn. Hunger gnawed, now not sharp but constant, like a reminder tapping from within. "We go north?" Ruth whispered. Hannah shook her head slightly. West first. North would be expected. West meant uneven ground and fewer established paths. Hunters follow logic. To survive, you must bend it. As they moved through thicker underbrush, Hannah began dragging a long branch behind her again, brushing lightly over soil. It did not erase tracks entirely, but it distorted them enough to slow interpretation. Hours later, one of the hunting teams reached the swamp's edge. The dogs barked fiercely at the water, confused by broken scent. One hunter cursed. Another insisted the women had doubled back. Arguments sparked quickly. "Too heavy to cross that," a younger man said, pointing at the deep stretch. An older tracker crouched, studying disturbed reeds. Heavy don't mean helpless. He felt something shifting in his assumptions. By nightfall the hunters split again. Some attempted the swamp crossing, losing time and temper. Others circled wide, hoping to intercept on higher ground. Meanwhile, Hannah and Ruth pushed forward until the land rose into uneven ridges scattered with stone. The change in terrain tested different muscles. Climbing requires balance more than endurance. Their thighs burned with each step. Halfway up one slope, Ruth stumbled. Hannah caught her arm instantly. They froze, listening. No immediate sound of pursuit. Ruth exhaled slowly. Legs feel like fire. Hannah allowed herself a brief nod. Good. Fire means they still working. Pain was not unfamiliar. It had been companion for years in the fields. But this pain had direction. It moved them somewhere. At the ridge's peak, they paused to observe. From that height, faint columns of smoke could be seen in two distant directions. Hunting camps. They were closing in from multiple angles. Hannah studied the pattern. If they continued west, they risked intersecting one group. If they turned sharply south, they would circle back toward known plantation roads. Northwest offered narrow passes, difficult but less obvious. She pointed. Ruth did not question. Night brought colder air. The forest thinned slightly near rocky ground, forcing them to move more carefully to avoid silhouette against moonlight. Twice they dropped flat when distant voices carried on wind. The bounty hunters were learning. They no longer shouted recklessly. They moved quieter now, frustration sharpening focus. On the 10th day, rain returned but lighter this time, not enough to erase everything. Hannah saw opportunity in that too. Instead of avoiding open patches entirely, they crossed one deliberately, then split briefly in opposite directions before rejoining in shallow water beyond sightline. It was risky. Separation, even for minutes, can fracture safety, but it planted confusion. When one hunting team reached that clearing, they found two sets of tracks diverging. They split. Someone muttered. The group argued over which to follow. Time bled away in disagreement. By afternoon, the hunters were no longer unified in confidence. They were chasing shadows that refused to behave predictably. Hannah and Ruth felt the pressure tightening, though. Food was gone, water remained accessible, but energy faded faster without nourishment. That evening, while moving through a patch of low shrubs near a creek, Ruth spotted movement, small, quick. A rabbit. Instinct surged. Without skeeking, Hannah moved wide while Ruth crouched low. Years of working fields had honed their coordination. They understood each other's rhythm. Ruth lunged, hands fast despite exhaustion. The rabbit twisted, nearly escaping. Hannah intercepted, pinning it gently but firmly. They held still for a moment after, almost stunned by success. Food meant another day of strength. They built no fire. Raw meat is unpleasant but survivable. They ate slowly, giving thanks in silence, not through words but through shared understanding that survival requires adaptation beyond comfort. Meanwhile, tensions among the hunters escalated. Several men wanted to abandon the chase. Supplies thinned. Horses grew lame from uneven ground. The swamp crossing had cost one man a twisted ankle. Pride kept them moving, but morale cracked. Two women, one spat bitterly near a campfire. Another answered quietly. Maybe not just women. The idea unsettled them more than they admitted. On the 12th night, the hunters attempted coordination through signal whistles. Short bursts carried across distance to indicate position. It was efficient, but it also gave Hannah information. From a sheltered hollow, she listened to patterns, counted intervals between whistles, gauged spacing. "They're wide," she murmured. Ruth nodded. "Too wide." When groups spread too far apart, response time slows. That night, instead of continuing directly northwest, they angled slightly east for several miles, moving between two separated hunting teams. It was the narrowest margin they had attempted so far. At one point, torchlight flickered less than 200 yards away. Voices drifted, clearly complaints about mud, about wasted time. Ruth's breathing quickened. Hannah reached back, squeezing her hand once. Steady. They crouched low, using thick brush to obscure outline. Mosquitoes swarmed, biting exposed skin. They did not swat. Movement reveals position more than discomfort does. Minutes stretched like hours. Then the torchlight shifted away. When it was safe, they continued quiet as dusk. By dawn, they had slipped beyond the tightening ring. The hunters would wake believing the women were somewhere behind them. Instead, Hannah and Ruth were ahead. But survival extracts payment. Ruth's ankle, strained from the earlier stumble, began swelling. Each step produced a slight hitch in her gait. Hannah noticed immediately. "Lean on me," she whispered. Ruth resisted at first, pride flickering, but partnership requires surrender sometimes. She shifted weight slightly, allowing Hannah to bear more load. They moved slower that day, and for the first time since leaving the plantation, doubt crept in. Not doubt in each other, doubt in distance. How far was freedom truly? Stories of safe territories circulated like legends, but maps were not given to them. Directions were fragments overheard, pieced together from rumor. What if they walked in circles? What if exhaustion overtook them before hope arrived? As if sensing the shift in Ruth's thoughts, Hannah spoke softly. "They still behind." Ruth looked at her. "As long as they behind," Hannah continued, "we ahead." Simple logic, powerful truth. The 13th night brought unexpected sound, a gunshot, distant but sharp. The hunters were firing blindly into forest, perhaps believing noise would flush prey. It did not. It only revealed impatience. Hannah and Ruth changed direction again, curving north once more, gradually reclaiming the trajectory toward rumored free territory. The forest began thinning as terrain shifted subtly. Soil felt firmer beneath their feet, fewer swamp pockets. With firmer ground came clearer tracks. They had to be more deliberate now. Hannah began stepping on exposed rocks whenever possible. Ruth followed carefully, minimizing imprint. Behind them, one persistent hunting team closed the gap. These men were quieter than the others, more disciplined. They had reduced to 6 but moved with purpose. Late on the 14th afternoon, as Hannah and Ruth climbed another low ridge, a dog bark echoed startlingly close. Too close. They froze. Branches snapped below. The disciplined team had cut through confusion and followed faint signs others dismissed. Ruth's ankle trembled under strain. Hannah scanned quickly left, steep drop right, dense thicket forward, narrow crest. Up, she breathed. They climbed the crest, using hands to pull upward. Stones shifted under weight. The barking intensified. Reaching the top, Hannah saw what she needed: a sharp descent covered in loose shale. Dangerous. Unstable. Perfect. She and Ruth slid down deliberately, dislodging stones in controlled cascade. The slope amplified falling rock, creating chaotic movement and noise. Below, the hunting team hesitated. One man attempted descent and nearly lost footing, scrambling back up. Loose shale punishes heavy boots. By the time the hunters found safer path around, Hannah and Ruth had vanished into dense undergrowth beyond the ridge. Night swallowed the rest. They did not stop until stars fully claimed the sky. Finally, hidden beneath thick canopy, they collapsed, side by side, breath ragged but alive. 2 weeks. 14 days of pursuit by 50 men reduced now by exhaustion and pride. Ruth stared upward through leaves. They still coming? Hannah listened to distant forest. Yes. Ruth closed her eyes briefly. Good. Hannah turned slightly toward her cousin. Good, she asked. Ruth's voice was faint but steady. Means we still free. And in that quiet exchange lay the heart of their endurance. Freedom was no longer a destination. It was each step not captured, each breath not owned, each night survived beyond expectation. The hunters believed the chase was about distance. Hannah and Ruth understood it was about time. And time, so far, belonged to them. By the 15th day, the forest no longer felt endless. It felt measured. Measured in blisters, measured in breaths, measured in how long 2 bodies could continue carrying not only themselves but each other. Morning light filtered thin and gray through tall pines. Hannah woke first again, though sleep had barely touched her. She listened the way she always did now, not for birds, not for wind, but for disruption. Forest has its own rhythm. When that rhythm breaks, danger is near. Nothing yet. Ruth stirred slowly. Her ankle had swollen overnight, stiff from yesterday's descent down the shale ridge. When she tried to stand, her jaw tightened. Hannah noticed. Without speaking, she crouched and pressed gently around the joint. No bone out of place, just strain, painful but survivable. We move slower, Hannah said quietly. Ruth exhaled. They moved slower too. It was true. The hunters were tiring. 50 had become fewer. Pride had thinned their ranks. But the ones who remained were not careless. They were patient now. That made them dangerous. The terrain ahead began to change again. Pines gave way to mixed woodland. Fewer swamps. More open patches between trees. It would be harder to disappear completely. They needed something different, not just distance. Disruption. By midday, they reached a narrow creek running shallow but steady over smooth stone. Hannah crouched, studying the current. Water movement here was faster than swamp water. Scent would break cleaner. She looked at Ruth. Ruth nodded before she even spoke. They stepped in and began moving upstream. Upstream confuses tracking dogs. Most escapees move with current for ease. Moving against it demands strength and leaves fewer predictable exits. The water was cold enough to numb calves within minutes. Slippery stones tested balance. Twice Ruth nearly fell, catching herself on Hannah's shoulder. They stayed in the creek nearly 2 miles. When they finally exited, it was at a bend where overhanging roots created natural concealment. Hannah carefully brushed away disturbed sediment at the bank. Ruth broke a small branch and swept lightly across the exit point. They moved into thicker brush immediately, angling not north, not west, but southeast. Back toward where hunters would least expect. Behind them, one of the disciplined hunting teams reached the creek hours later. The dogs barked furiously at the waterline but struggled to regain direction. The lead tracker crouched, scanning both banks. They crossed. Someone muttered. "Which way?" Another demanded. Silence. Because for the first time since the chase began, the answer was unclear. The women were no longer simply fleeing. They were shaping the pursuit. That night, Hannah and Ruth did something they had not dared before. They lit a fire. Small, hidden between rocks, fed only with dry wood collected carefully. The risk was real, but so was necessity. Ruth's ankle needed warmth. Their bodies needed heat. The flame flickered low, barely visible beyond immediate circle. Ruth stretched her leg closer, jaw relaxing slightly as warmth eased stiffness. "You ever think," she said softly, they scared. Hannah looked at her through the dim light. "Hunters?" she asked. Ruth nodded. Hannah considered. "Yes." "Why?" "Because they don't understand." Ruth frowned slightly. "They don't understand why we're not tired yet," Hannah continued. "They don't understand why we're not begging to be found." Silence returned, broken only by quiet crackle of flame. For years the plantation had defined them by weight, by size, by slowness, but weight meant strength. Size meant endurance. Slowness meant control. The hunters were chasing an idea of weakness. They were meeting something else entirely. By the 17th day, the chase began affecting the hunters in visible ways. Two men argued violently over direction after misreading a broken branch. Another insisted the women had outside help. One swore he heard laughter at night near camp. Fear shifts perception. And when prey refuses to act like prey, fear grows faster. Hannah sensed this shift even without seeing it directly. The pattern of whistles changed. The spacing between camps tightened again. They were compressing their search zone. They had to force expansion. That afternoon they approached a rocky outcrop overlooking a narrow path. The path below showed clear signs of frequent use, likely a natural funnel between territories. If hunters believed the women were heading toward free land, they would guard passes like this. Hannah crouched, studying the slope above the pass. Loose soil, scattered stones, thick brush at the crest. She looked at Ruth. "We make them see us," she said. Ruth blinked once. "On purpose?" "Yes." Risk sharpened the air between them. That evening, just before dusk, they moved deliberately across the ridge crest where distant hunters could glimpse silhouette against fading sky. It happened quickly. A shout from below. Gunshot cracking through trees. Ruth flinched, but Hannah held firm. They ran not blindly but upward along the ridge where footing was unstable. Behind them, hunters scrambled into the pass, convinced capture was near. Hannah reached the prepared slope first. Earlier they had loosened several clusters of rock quietly, testing stability. Now, as hunters began climbing directly beneath, Hannah kicked hard at one pile. Stones cascaded downward. Ruth followed, dislodging another. The slope came alive. Rocks tumbled violently into the narrow pass, forcing hunters to scatter. One man slipped, sliding backward. Another shouted in pain as debris struck his shoulder. The chaos lasted seconds, long enough. Hannah grabbed Ruth's hand, and together they vanished into brush beyond the ridge, circling wide while hunters regrouped below. By nightfall, the disciplined team had split again. Frustration had evolved into something heavier. Respect. They no longer spoke of two fat slaves. They spoke of those women. Recognition of humanity often begins in fear, but survival does not pause for philosophical shifts. On the 19th day, Ruth's ankle worsened again. The ridge maneuver had strained it further. She tried to hide the limp, but Hannah noticed the rhythm change immediately. "We rest longer tonight," Hannah said. "No," Ruth answered firmly. "We close." Close to what neither fully knew, but the forest felt different. Air slightly drier, fewer plantation birds, more wild silence. Stories whispered in quarters had mentioned a river further north, a boundary many slave catchers hesitated to cross without clear jurisdiction. If they could reach it, the thought fueled them. That night, under heavy cloud cover, they pushed farther than before. Pain sharpened each step, but momentum mattered more now than comfort. Near midnight, distant barking resumed. The disciplined team had regained trail, this time closer than before. Hannah calculated quickly. Running straight would exhaust Ruth. Turning again might not create enough confusion. They needed obstruction. Ahead lay a stretch of dense briar thicket, sharp, tangled, almost impassable without tools. Perfect. They entered without hesitation. Thorns tore fabric, scratched skin. drew thin lines of blood, but their size allowed them to push branches aside that smaller frames might struggle with. Hannah broke stems deliberately behind them, weaving branches back into place. By the time the hunters reached the thicket, hesitation stalled them. One man tried pushing through and cursed loudly as briars tore at his clothes. Another suggested circling. Time slipped again. Inside the thicket, Hannah and Ruth moved slowly but steadily until they reached its far edge and angled sharply north once more. Dawn approached faintly when they finally heard it. Water, not creek water, not swamp water, wide, steady. They pushed through last line of trees and saw it, the river stretching pale in early light. Not enormous, not impossible, but boundary. Ruth exhaled something between a laugh and a sob. Hannah scanned both banks quickly. No visible camp, no immediate movement. "We cross," Ruth said. Hannah nodded. The water would be cold, deep in places. Dangerous, but so was staying. They stepped in together, current pressed hard against thighs. Stones shifted underfoot. Midway across, Ruth stumbled, nearly swept sideways. Hannah grabbed her arm with both hands, planting her feet wide against the force. "Hold," she commanded. Ruth steadied. Step by step, they pushed through. When they reached the opposite bank, collapsing onto wet sand, the sound of distant barking carried faintly from behind. The hunters had reached the forest edge, but rivers complicate pursuit. Jurisdiction shifts. Confidence falters. Hannah rolled onto her back, staring up at pale morning sky. Ruth lay beside her, breathing hard but smiling faintly despite exhaustion. "They're still behind," Ruth whispered. Hannah listened. "Yes," she said quietly. Then she turned her head slightly toward her cousin. "But we still ahead." The river did not guarantee freedom, but it marked something undeniable. For 19 days, 50 hunters had chased 2 women they believed too heavy to outrun them. For 19 days, the women had shaped terrain, redirected pursuit, and endured beyond expectation. Now the chase had crossed a boundary, and on the far bank of that river, the hunt would change forever. The river did not wash away danger. It only changed its shape. By the time the sun rose fully above the tree line, Hannah and Ruth had already moved inland from the bank, careful not to leave clear impressions in the wet sand. Crossing water breaks scent, but exiting it carelessly invites rediscovery. Hannah used a broken reed to sweep lightly behind them. Ruth stepped where stones interrupted mud. They did not speak much. Crossing the river had cost them energy they did not have to spare. Behind them, on the opposite bank, the hunters gathered. 6 of them now. The disciplined ones. They stood at the water's edge studying current, arguing quietly. Crossing meant risk, legal and physical. Some counties did not welcome armed men chasing property claims without permission, and rivers swallow horses easily when crossed poorly. But pride does not retreat easily. After nearly 3 weeks, turning back empty-handed would be humiliation. One of them began wading in. The others followed. Hannah did not see this, but she felt it. You can sense when a storm decides to continue instead of passing. The land beyond the river felt different, less familiar, less shaped by plantation order. The forest was older, trees thicker, underbrush heavier but less trampled by routine travel. Freedom was not visible yet, but it felt closer. They moved slowly through the morning, following no obvious path. Ruth's ankle had stiffened again after the cold crossing. Every incline made her breath tighten. By midday, they found a hollow beneath exposed tree roots and rested. For the first time since leaving the plantation, they allowed themselves more than a few minutes of stillness. Hannah listened carefully. Nothing. No whistles. No barking. Only wind. Ruth closed her eyes. Maybe they stop. Hannah did not answer immediately. They did come this far to stop, she said finally. And she was right. By late afternoon, the disciplined team had crossed the river downstream where current was calmer. They moved quieter now than ever before. No more shouting, no careless gunshots. They had shed everything unnecessary extra gear, heavy packs. They carried only weapons, rope, and determination. They were adapting. So would Hannah and Ruth. As evening approached, the forest opened into rolling terrain dotted with tall grass patches between clusters of oak and sycamore. Open ground is dangerous. It exposes movement, but it also reveals pursuers more easily. Hannah paused at the edge of one clearing. If they close, she murmured, we don't hide. Ruth looked at her. We move straight. Sometimes unpredictability is the strongest shield. They crossed the clearing at steady pace, not running, not crouching. From a distance, in fading light, they could resemble workers moving with purpose rather than fugitives fleeing. Halfway across, a sound broke the quiet, a single dog bark, closer than before. Hannah did not turn her head. "Keep," she said. Ruth swallowed and continued walking. From the tree line behind them, two figures emerged, then another. The disciplined team had regained visual contact. "Stop," one of the hunters shouted, gun raised. Hannah did not stop. Neither did Ruth. A shot cracked through the air, splintering bark from a tree to their left. Warning, not yet aiming to kill. They wanted them alive. Alive meant reward. Alive meant proof. Hannah calculated quickly. Running across open field would make them easier targets. Diving into trees ahead would buy seconds, but the hunters were closer now than at any point since the ridge. "Right," Hannah whispered suddenly. Ruth did not question. They veered sharply toward a shallow dip in the terrain, barely noticeable from distance, but deeper than it appeared. As they reached it, they dropped low and slid into the depression, disappearing from direct sightline. The hunters reached the clearing a seconds later. Where? Confusion. The dip masked immediate visibility. By the time the hunters adjusted position and spotted the women climbing out the far side, distance had reopened slightly. But not enough. The dog lunged forward, pulling hard. Ruth's ankle faltered as she climbed. Hannah stopped, pretending there was no weakness. She grabbed Ruth's arm and half-dragged, half-supported her up the slope. "Leave me," Ruth hissed under breath. Hannah's answer was simple. No. Behind them, the hunters descended into the dip, losing momentum briefly but not fully. They were committed now. The forest ahead thickened into a stand of young trees close together. Not large trunks, narrow ones, packed tight. Movement through them required pushing aside branches constantly. For two broad-shouldered women, it was difficult. For armed men with rifles slung across backs, it was worse. Hannah pushed through first, forcing branches open. Ruth followed in the path she created. Behind them, hunters cursed as twigs snagged straps and scratched faces. The dog yelped as briars caught its fur. Momentum slowed on both sides. Breath grew louder. Hannah could hear one hunter gaining ground, lighter on his feet than the others. Younger, perhaps. They burst from the dense stand into uneven ground scattered with fallen logs and shallow pits where roots had decayed. Terrain that punishes speed. Perfect. Hannah did not shout instructions. She simply changed pace. Instead of running straight, she angled diagonally across the fallen logs, stepping on unstable surfaces deliberately. Ruth followed pattern instantly. Behind them, the young hunter attempted to match the route. He stepped on one moss-covered trunk that rolled under weight. He fell hard, rifle clattering. The delay cost him. The remaining hunters slowed to navigate the same hazards more carefully. Distance widened again, but not enough to relax. As night approached, clouds gathered once more. Air thickened with promise of rain. Hannah sensed opportunity. Storms had shielded them before. They pushed harder despite exhaustion. When first drops began falling, they were nearing a stretch of low marsh intersected by narrow animal paths barely visible unless you looked carefully. Hannah recognized signs of deer passage, subtle depressions weaving through tall reeds. "Follow small," she said. They moved along deer paths, feet landing where hooves had compacted soil. Human tracks blend easier when layered over animal movement. Rain intensified. Thunder rolled. Behind them, hunters pressed forward stubbornly. But heavy rain disrupts discipline. Sound becomes unreliable. Visibility narrows. Another shot rang out wild, frustrated. Lightning flashed bright enough to illuminate everything for a heartbeat. In that flash, Hannah saw something ahead. Not forest, not open field, a cabin, small, isolated, weathered. Too distant to know who occupied it, too close to ignore. Ruth saw it too. Risk multiplied instantly. If the cabin belonged to someone sympathetic, it could mean shelter. If hostile, it meant exposure. Behind them, the dog barked again. Choice narrowed. They angled toward the cabin. By the time they reached its edge, rain poured heavy enough to obscure clear vision. Smoke did not rise from chimney. No immediate sign of movement. Hannah approached cautiously, staying to side of door rather than directly in front. She knocked once. No answer. Another knock. Footsteps inside. Both women tensed. The door opened slowly. An older black man stood there, eyes sharp despite years etched across his face. He looked from one woman to the other, took in soaked clothes. Mud. Fear and determination layered together. Behind them, distant barking echoed faintly through storm. He did not ask questions. He stepped aside. Quick. They entered. Door closed. Inside, the cabin was sparse but dry. A small fire burned low in hearth. Ruth nearly collapsed from relief. Hannah remained standing. The man spoke quietly. "They coming?" "Yes," Hannah answered. He nodded once. Without further words, he moved toward back wall and lifted a section of rug, revealing a narrow trapdoor. "Down," he said. Ruth hesitated only a second before descending the ladder beneath. Hannah followed. The space below was cramped but concealed. Earth walls, barely enough room to crouch. Above them, the trapdoor closed. Moments later, pounding on cabin door echoed. Voices shouted. The older man, his voice answered calmly, claiming ignorance, claiming storm shelter. Boots stomped across wooden floor overhead. The dog barked loudly inside the cabin now. Hannah felt Ruth, his hand find hers in darkness. They did not breathe fully. They waited. Minutes stretched like hours. The dog scratched at floor once, then again. Hannah's muscles tensed. But thunder cracked violently overhead, shaking cabin walls. The dog yelped, distracted. Voices argued above. One hunter accused the old man of lying. Another insisted they were losing time in storm. Finally, Boots retreated. Door slammed. Silence returned gradually, replaced only by steady rain. They waited longer. Only when trapdoor creaked open did Hannah allow breath to leave her lungs fully. The old man looked down at them. "They cross river?" he asked. "Yes." He nodded slowly. "Then you closer than you think." Hope flickered, not loud, not reckless, but steady. For 3 weeks, 50 hunters had pursued 2 women across swamp, ridge, and river. Now only a handful remained. And for the first time since stepping into that first storm, Hannah and Ruth were not alone. The hunt was not over, but the balance had shifted, and somewhere beyond the trees and Ran, freedom was no longer a rumor, it was direction. The storm did not end that night. It softened toward dawn, but rain still whispered against the cabin roof when Hannah opened her eyes. For a moment she forgot where she was. The earth smell of the hidden cellar clung to her skin. Ruth lay beside her, breathing deeper than she had in days. Real rest had found her for the first time since the plantation. Above them, floorboards creaked gently. The old man had not asked their names. They had not asked his. In times like this, names could become liabilities. When the trapdoor opened again, pale morning light filtered down. "You got some hours," the old man said quietly. "They rode north before sunrise. Think you headed that way?" Hannah climbed up first, muscles protesting but steady. Ruth followed more slowly, testing her ankle. The cabin interior looked different in daylight, small, rough, but orderly. A single table, 2 chairs, a stack of firewood near the hearth. On the far wall hung a faded map of surrounding counties. Hannah's eyes went to it immediately. The old man noticed. He walked over and tapped a finger against a thin blue line cutting across the page. "You crossed here?" he asked. Hannah nodded. He traced upward slightly. Another river 3 days north, wider, harder to cross, but beyond that, he paused. Different laws, not safety, but better chance. Ruth leaned against the table, listening carefully. "Hunters 1T stop," the old man continued. "But they thinner now. Storm took some of their fight." He handed them each a small cloth bundle, cornbread, dried beans, and a piece of smoked meat, food. Real food. Ruth swallowed hard. "We pay you back," she said instinctively. The old man looked at her long and steady. "You already have," he replied. There are moments in survival when gratitude must remain unspoken because speaking it breaks composure. Hannah nodded once, deeply. They left before midday. Not directly north. Never directly. Instead, they moved northeast at first, circling wide to avoid obvious direction. The forest here felt older, less shaped by plantation control. Fewer cut paths, more fallen timber. Wildlife signs more frequent. Ruth's ankle held better after warmth and rest, though she still favored it slightly. Hannah adjusted pace without comment. By afternoon, they reached rising terrain again, low hills covered in mixed oak and pine. From the crest of one slope, Hannah paused to listen. Nothing immediate, but that meant little. The disciplined hunters had learned silence. Back near the first river, the remaining 6 men regrouped after the failed cabin search. The youngest among them, Caleb, argued they should abandon pursuit. "We're near month," end, he said. Owner INT doubling reward forever. The leader, a broad-shouldered tracker named Harlan, shook his head. They crossed river, Harlan said. Means they believe something up there worth crossing for. Caleb spat into dirt. Or they desperate? Harlan looked toward the tree line. Desperate folk don't move like that. There it was again, respect buried beneath frustration. They resumed the hunt, but now the chase felt different, less about money, more about pride. Hannah sensed pursuit returning by the 20th day, not through sound at first, through absence. Birdsong in one direction fell silent too quickly. Deer trails showed recent disturbance not made by hoof. Humans. She angled slightly west again, testing response. An hour later, distant whistle, short. Measured. They were close enough to communicate quietly. 4, maybe 5, Ruth guessed. 6, Hannah answered. She felt it in the spacing. They needed something bigger than terrain now. They needed delay. By late afternoon, they reached a stretch of forest scarred by past lightning strike. Several trees lay collapsed in tangled formation, roots upturned like walls. It created a natural maze, passages narrow and unpredictable. Hannah stopped. Ruth read her expression. We don't go through, Ruth said. Hannah shook her head. We shape it. They moved quickly despite fatigue, dragging smaller fallen branches into already narrow passages, tightening choke points. Hannah wedged a heavy limb between two root walls, leaving just enough space for a person to squeeze through, but not easily. It cost energy, valuable energy. But it bought something more precious, time. They then circled wide around the maze and continued north. When the hunters reached the fallen timber stretch near dusk, they hesitated. The dog strained forward. Harlan studied the tangled roots carefully. They've been here, he murmured. Caleb moved ahead impatiently and attempted to squeeze through the tightest passage. His rifle caught. His coat snagged. He cursed loudly. Another hunter tried a different route, only to encounter blocked limbs. They built this, one of them realized, not random, intentional. Harlan's jaw tightened. They slowing us. He felt the shift clearly now. This was no longer chase. It was contest. Night forced the hunters to camp near the timber maze, losing hours to frustration. Meanwhile, Hannah and Ruth pressed forward under starlight. Food from the cabin sustained them enough to maintain pace, but exhaustion layered thick beneath muscle. On the 22nd day, terrain flattened into long stretches of tall grass broken by occasional tree clusters. Visibility extended farther here. Dangerous, but promising. Wind moved constantly, carrying scent in unpredictable ways. Good for masking. They spotted smoke near horizon by midday. Not plantation smoke. Different. Thinner. Scattered. Ruth's heart thudded. Settlement? She whispered. Hannah studied carefully. Could be, or trap. They moved cautiously closer, using tree lines for cover. As they approached within safer distance, they saw cabins, 3 of them, rough but maintained, no overseer fields surrounding, no fences, free black settlement, possibly, or simply isolated farmers. Approaching strangers carried risk equal to avoiding them. Behind them, faint but real, a whistle sounded again. Hunters closing. Choice made itself. They moved toward the cabins. A woman emerged from the nearest one, carrying water bucket. She froze upon seeing the mud-covered, worn, eyes sharp with survival. Hannah stopped at visible distance, hands empty and lowered. We don't mean harm, she said evenly. The woman studied them carefully. Behind her, a man stepped out holding an axe, not raised but ready. You running, he observed quietly. Yes. Hunters. Yes. Silence stretched. The woman looked at the man, then back at Hannah and Ruth. 2nd River North, she said softly. 2 days if strong, they won T-cross easy. The man stepped forward slightly. We can hide you long. Hannah nodded. We're not asking long. They were given water. More food. Directions spoken in careful detail. Avoid the shallow ravine to the east. Take the ridgeline past split oak tree. Watch for abandoned mill foundation. Small acts, massive impact. By the time hunters reached the open grassland later that afternoon, wind had erased clear direction. Harlan scanned horizon and saw faint smoke from settlement chimneys. He narrowed his eyes.
They lost there?
Caleb muttered. Maybe, Harlan replied. But when they reached the cabins, the residents were calm, uninformed, unhelpful. Truth hidden behind steady faces. The hunters left dissatisfied but without proof. 2 more days of pursuit would break something, either the women or the men. On the 24th day, Hannah and Ruth saw it. The second river, wider than the first, moving stronger. No shallow crossing visible immediately. Ruth exhaled slowly. They right. Hannah walked along bank, scanning upstream and down. Crossing here would require more than wading. They followed bank westward until they found remnants of old mill foundation the cabin man had described, rotted beams half submerged. Possibility. With combined strength, they dragged one beam free, heavy, waterlogged. Another smaller one. It was not a boat, but it would float enough to aid crossing. It took nearly an hour to position beams into crude support. Time they did not truly have. Distant whistle carried faintly from forest behind. Closer than ever before. Ruth looked at Hannah. No turning now. Hannah nodded. They pushed beams into water and climbed carefully, using them for buoyancy while kicking steadily across current. The river fought harder than the first. Midway across, a shout echoed from opposite bank. Hunters had reached clearing. Gunshot cracked. Water splashed near them. Another shot. Hannah felt the river pull hard at her waist. "Kick," she commanded. Ruth's injured ankle screamed with effort but obeyed. The beams shifted dangerously, but current also complicated aim. Bullets struck water wide. The hunters could not cross quickly without preparing properly. By the time they reached the far bank, dragging themselves onto muddy shore, the distance between banks had become barrier of more than water. Harlan stood on the opposite side, breathing hard, rifle lowered slowly. For a long moment, he and Hannah looked at each other across moving current, not as hunter and prey, as opponents. Then Hannah stood fully upright despite exhaustion. She took Ruth's hand, and together they turned away. Behind them lay swamp, ridge, river, storm, maze, open field, and pursuit by 50 reduced to 6. Ahead lay uncertainty, but also something else. Space. The hunters did not fire again, because deep down, even pride recognizes a line when it has been crossed. And for the first time since the plantation bell last rang their names, the hunt was no longer certain. It was fading. The second river marked more than distance. It marked doubt. On the far bank, Hannah and Ruth did not stop moving, even after their legs trembled from the crossing. Mud clung heavy to their clothes and river water soaked deep into bone. But behind them the current roared like a living wall. The hunters would have to decide whether pride outweighed risk. Hannah did not trust pride to fail easily. They moved inland until trees thickened and the river became a dull, distant sound. Only then did they allow themselves to collapse against the base of a wide sycamore. Ruth laughed once short, breathless, almost disbelieving. "They did follow." "Not yet," Hannah answered. That word carried weight. Not yet. Because men like Harlan did not quit at the edge of difficulty. They recalculated. Across the river, the hunters argued again. Caleb threw his hat to the ground. "You saw that current. We lose horses if we try blind." One of the older men shook his head. "Owner won't pay if we drown." Harlan stared at the opposite bank long after the others fell silent. "They ain't stopping," he said quietly. "Neither are we." But when they finally moved downstream searching for a safer crossing, daylight was already fading. Time, the thing Hannah and Ruth had fought hardest to claim, continued slipping in their favor. On the 25th day, the land beyond the second river revealed subtle change. Fewer signs of plantation expansion, no large crop fields carved into forest. Trails felt older, less traveled by armed patrols. But danger does not disappear when law shifts. It only changes hands. Hannah knew that even in territories less friendly to slave catchers, a reward could still tempt the wrong man. They needed not just distance. They needed direction. The settlement couple had spoken of a trading road 2 days north a route used by free black farmers and traveling laborers, harder for hunters to patrol without attracting attention. If they reached it, the chase would become complicated for anyone crossing state lines without cause. Ruth's ankle had swollen again after the second river, but she refused to let pain dictate pace. "We close," she said through clenched jaw. Hannah nodded, though fatigue pressed heavy across her shoulders. She felt it now. Deep exhaustion laid beneath resolve. Muscles did not respond as quickly. Thoughts required effort. 3.5 weeks. Most chases end long before this. By midday, Clouds gathered again, not violent like earlier storms, but thick enough to dull sun and cast grey over land. Wind shifted direction frequently, carrying scents unpredictably. Good. It meant if the hunters attempted crossing upstream, tracking would not be simple. But Hannah never assumed safety. She paused frequently, listening, scanning. Late afternoon brought the first clear sign. Boot print. Not theirs. Fresh enough that edges remained sharp. Ruth saw it too. They crossed, she whispered. Hannah crouched, pressing fingers into the impression. Boot larger than average. Likely Harlan. Only a few, not all 6. That meant division. Division means vulnerability. But it also means desperation. They were close again. Closer than either side likely preferred. Hannah stood slowly. No more circling, she said. We go straight north. Ruth met her eyes. Fight if have to? Hannah did not answer immediately, if cornered. They walked faster now, conserving silence but not distance. The forest thinned gradually into rolling meadows, dotted with scattered trees. In the distance, faint shape of smoke rose, more structured than settlement earlier. Road? It had to be. Behind them, branches snapped faintly. Too faint for untrained ear. But Hannah heard. They coming, she breathed. Ruth's jaw tightened. The hunters had cut through terrain more efficiently this time, likely using knowledge gained from earlier mistakes. They were lighter now, no extra supplies, no hesitation. The chase narrowed into something sharp. As evening approached, Hannah spotted a narrow ravine, ahead shallow but steep-sided in parts. It ran east-west, cutting across their northward path. She stopped. Ruth understood instantly. If we cross straight, Ruth said, they see where we climb out. Hannah nodded. They angled west along the ravine and said, stay near its edge until they found a section where overhanging brush concealed descent. They climbed down carefully and moved within the ravine itself, using its natural walls to break line of sight. Halfway through, Hannah began doing something deliberate. She slowed. She pressed her feet harder into damp soil. Clearer prints, Ruth noticed. Why? Let them follow. It was a risk, but sometimes the best way to escape is to guide pursuit exactly where you want it. The ravine narrowed ahead into a sharp bend where one side steepened dramatically. Loose soil, unstable. Hannah remembered the shale ridge from earlier weeks. Terrain punishes impatience. They climbed out at a less obvious point before the bend and circled wide through thick brush, doubling back silently above the ravine wall. Moments later, voices echoed below. Harlan's team had entered the ravine. Caleb's voice carried frustration. They fresh, close. Boots moved faster now, encouraged by visible tracks. They reached the bend. The youngest hunter tried climbing the steep inner wall quickly to shorten distance. The soil gave way. He slid hard, colliding with another man below. Chaos erupted briefly. Not catastrophic, but disorienting. By the time Harlan steadied his team and scanned above the ravine, the women were already moving north again unseen. But the hunters were relentless. Within an hour, they had corrected direction again. Dusk painted the sky deep orange when the forest finally gave way to a visible dirt road stretching east-west. Wagon ruts cut deep into hardened earth. Hannah stopped at its edge. Ruth stepped beside her. This was it. Crossing meant exposure, but staying hidden meant eventual cornering. From behind, a single whistle sounded close. Too close. Hannah made decision instantly. They did not run across the road. They walked onto it openly, straight-backed. Steady, as if they belonged there, as if they were simply two laboring women heading home from field work. Moments later, 2 wagons approached from the west, drawn by mules. On the lead wagon sat a black driver, older, watchful. He slowed slightly upon seeing them. Behind, emerging from tree line, the hunters burst forward. Stop them, Caleb shouted. The wagon driver's eyes flicked between the armed white men and the 2 mud-streaked women walking calmly on the road. Understanding flashed quickly. Hannah did not look back. Ruth did not run. The driver snapped his reins sharply. The wagon lurched forward directly between the women and the approaching hunters. Dust kicked up. The second wagon followed, blocking view. By the time hunters reached the road, visibility was broken by wooden frames and startled mules. Move? Harlan barked. But the drivers moved, slowly, deliberately slow, claiming confusion, claiming poor hearing. Seconds matter in a chase. And seconds multiplied now. Hannah and Ruth stepped off the road on the far side, blending into a group of walking laborers trailing behind the wagons, heads down, pace even. The hunters pushed through wagons finally and scanned frantically. Too many bodies, too much movement. Which two? No longer obvious. Harlan's eyes searched desperately. He saw broad shoulders, but broad shoulders existed elsewhere too. The women did not look back. They walked north along the road with the group until distance widened beyond certainty. Only when twilight fully settled did they slip quietly from the traveling line into sidebrush and continue north alone. Behind them, on the road, Harlan lowered his rifle slowly. For the first time in weeks, uncertainty outweighed pride. They had crossed two rivers, they had shaped terrain, they had turned the forest itself into ally, and now they had stepped into a world where hunters could not easily separate them from others. The chase had not ended, but it had fractured, and as night swallowed the road behind them, Hannah finally allowed herself a whisper. "They're losing us." Ruth, walking steady despite pain, answered softly, "They already did." And somewhere far behind, on a dirt road filled with dust and fading light, 6 men realized the hunt had slipped beyond their grasp, not through speed, not through violence, but through endurance, unity, and a refusal to be what they had been told they were. The road stretched north into darkness, and for the first time since the plantation bell last told their names, the darkness did not feel like fear. It felt like possibility. By the time the sun rose on the 30th morning, the world behind them felt less like pursuit and more like memory, not gone, not harmless, but distant in a way that made breathing easier. Hannah woke before Ruth, as she always did. Years of forced labor had trained her body to rise before light. For a moment she lay still, listening, wind across tall grass. A mourning dove somewhere far off. No boots, no horses, no angry voices cutting through trees. They had traveled north for 4 more days after the road incident, keeping mostly to wooded edges, but no longer hiding with the desperation of cornered animals. The trading road had stretched farther than they expected, connecting small clusters of farms and settlements where free black families lived quietly, carefully, always aware of the fragile nature of safety. But fragile did not mean non-existent. On the 31st day, they reached a modest homestead set slightly back from the road. Smoke rose steady from its chimney. Corn stalks stood trimmed and bundled. A small fence garden bore late-season greens. Ruth slowed. "We ask?" Hannah studied the place carefully. No large house, no overseer-esque architecture, no patrol dogs. Just a narrow porch and a wooden bench. "We ask," she decided. An older black woman opened the door when they approached. Her face held the kind of calm that comes from surviving many seasons. She did not look surprised to see them. "You've been walking long," the woman said quietly. Hannah nodded. The woman's eyes moved over their clothes, the mud, the exhaustion layered beneath their posture. "Come inside." No questions about ownership papers, no interrogation. Inside, warmth wrapped around them. The smell of simmering beans filled the room. A man emerged from another doorway, tall, gray in his beard. He studied them with cautious understanding. "South?" he asked. "Yes," Hannah answered. He nodded once. "You crossed rivers?" "Yes." That was enough. They ate slowly at first, then with hunger they had suppressed for weeks. Ruth nearly cried at the taste of real food cooked without urgency. The couple, Isaac and Lila, did not offer empty promises. They spoke plainly. "You far enough that casual hunters won trouble," Isaac said, "but if they determined, they ask questions." Lila added softly, "And some folks answer wrong questions." Hannah understood. Freedom was not a single border. It was a shifting line of alliances and courage. They stayed 2 nights. Isaac provided directions to a larger settlement farther north, one known for protecting its own, a place where labor was exchanged fairly, and strangers were judged by character, not chains. On the 3rd morning, before leaving, Ruth turned to Layla. "Why help?" Layla's expression softened. "Because someone once helped me." The answer carried weight far beyond the room. They left with fresh bread wrapped in cloth and a small knife Isaac pressed into Hannah's hand. "Not for hunting," he said, "for certainty." The settlement lay 3 days ahead. As they walked, landscape shifted gradually into rolling farmland broken by patches of forest, fewer signs of plantation control, more independent fences, more children playing near fields. On the 34th day, They saw it, a cluster of modest homes surrounding a larger central building that looked half church, half meeting hall. Smoke curled from several chimneys. Voices drifted lightly through afternoon air. Ruth slowed, emotion tightening her throat. "This real?" she whispered. Hannah did not answer immediately. They approached openly. A man repairing a wagon wheel looked up first. His eyes flicked to their clothes, their worn boots. "You passing through?" he asked. "Looking to stay," Hannah replied evenly. The man stood, wiping his hands. "You come from south?" "Yes." He studied them for a long moment. Then he nodded toward the central building, talked to Reverend Cole. Inside, the air smelled faintly of pine boards and lamp oil. A tall man with kind but sharp eyes listened as Hannah spoke, brief, direct, without dramatics. She did not recount every chase. She did not describe Harlan. She simply said, "We ran. We stayed running. We don't aim to stop." Reverend Cole nodded slowly. "We don't ask pasts here unless someone chooses to share," he said. "We ask willingness." "For what?" Ruth asked. "For community, for work, for protection." Hannah met his gaze. "We know work." A faint smile touched his face. "Good. Because freedom ain't rest, it's responsibility." That evening they were given a small room in a shared house. Nothing grand. Just 2 beds, a wash basin, and a window that faced open land rather than watchtowers. Ruth stood at that window long after dark. "No bell," she murmured. "No bell," Hannah agreed. Days turned into weeks. Hannah took to carpentry quickly, learning from older craftsmen who cared more about skill than size. Her strength, once mocked, became valued. She could lift beams others struggled with. She shaped timber with steady precision. Ruth joined women tending crops and later began helping in the settlement, a small school, reading alongside children who were learning letters for the first time. For the first time in their lives, labor ended because the sun set, not because someone commanded it. But peace did not erase caution. Word traveled. On the 42nd day since escape, a rider appeared at the settlement edge. White man, unfamiliar horse. The settlement responded without panic. Men paused work casually but positioned themselves between homes and the road. Women gathered children inside quietly. Hannah stood beside Ruth near the meeting hall. The rider spoke with Reverend Cole briefly, voices too low to hear. Then the rider left. No confrontation, no gunfire. But the message was clear. Hunters still searched. That night, a meeting was held. "If they come with claim," one man said, "we demand proof." "And if proof forged?" another asked. Silence settled heavy. Reverend Cole spoke firmly. "No one here handed over without community witness." Hannah felt something unfamiliar then. Not fear. Support. She turned to Ruth. "We're not alone," Ruth whispered. "No," Hannah said softly. "We're not." Days passed without incident. The rider did not return. Perhaps Harlan, as pursuit had fractured beyond repair. Perhaps distance and resistance finally outweighed reward. Or perhaps the world simply moved on to other hunts. On the 50th day, the settlement held a gathering, music, food, children running freely. A celebration of harvest. Hannah stood near the edge of the field, watching Ruth laugh with a group of women. The sound struck her deeply, not forced, not guarded. Free laughter. Isaac and Leela had been right. Someone helps. Then someone else helps. Chains break not only by force, but by networks of courage. As evening settled, Reverend Cole approached Hannah. "You still look south sometimes," he observed gently. She nodded. "Habit. Or unfinished thought," Hannah considered. "I keep thinking they might appear." "And if they do?" Hannah's gaze moved across the settlement, men repairing fences, women carrying lanterns, children chasing fireflies. "Then they meet more than 2. Reverend Cole smiled faintly. "That is how change grows." Later that night, lying in her small bed, Hannah realized something profound. For weeks, survival had been measured in miles. Now it was measured in moments, moments of choice, moments of belonging, moments when no one shouted orders. The impossible escape that 50 bounty hunters could not contain had not ended in dramatic battle. It ended in something quieter. A community standing firm, and 2 women who refused to disappear. On the 60th day, Ruth walked beside Hannah through fields at dawn. "You think they stopped?" Ruth asked. Hannah looked at the horizon, wide, open, unguarded. "I think," she said slowly, "they tired of chasing what won surrender. Ruth smiled. Good. They kept walking, not because they had to run, but because forward had become habit. And this time, forward belonged to them. The first winter wind came early. It rolled down from the north in thin, sharp currents that bent tall grass and rattled loose shutters. Hannah stood outside the workshop as the air shifted colder against her skin. The change in season felt like a marker another line crossed, without chains, without pursuit, without a bell dragging her awake. 65 days since escape. No riders had returned. No questions had followed the first scout. But Hannah had learned never to mistake silence for safety. She hammered the final iron nail into a door frame and stepped back, wiping sweat from her brow despite the chill. The house belonged to a young couple expecting their first child. They had thanked her 3 times already for reinforcing the foundation before winter, before her strength had been exploited. Now it was requested. There was a difference. Ruth had changed too. The limp that once slowed her had faded into something barely noticeable. She spent mornings in the small schoolhouse guiding children through letters and numbers. Sometimes Hannah would pause outside just to listen. Ruth's voice carried patience. Patience she had not been allowed to own before. On the 72nd day, a messenger arrived from a settlement farther south. Not a bounty hunter, not a plantation agent. A free man traveling between communities. He carried news like weather, inevitable and shifting. "There's talk," he said during supper at the meeting hall. Owner down south, still claiming loss, sent letters farther than before. Hannah's fork paused midair. "How far?" Reverend Cole asked. "Across state lines." A murmur spread through the room. Ruth looked at Hannah steadily. Fear did not flare like before. It settled heavier, more thoughtful. After supper, Hannah stepped outside into cold night air. The sky stretched wide, sharp with stars. Ruth joined her. "They won't take it easy," Ruth said quietly. "No." "Then what we do?" Hannah studied the land beyond the settlement. "We start running." Ruth searched her face. "You sure?" Hannah nodded slowly. "Running kept us alive, but standing keeps us free." The next morning the settlement gathered. Reverend Cole spoke plainly. "If claim comes formal, we answer formal. If threat comes armed, we answer together." No one suggested handing them over. No one suggested retreat. A plan formed, papers documenting residence, witnesses prepared to testify, routes mapped for safe relocation if needed. Not panic, preparation. Weeks passed. Winter settled deep, frosting rooftops and stiffening earth. Hannah worked on building a larger storage barn with several men. During one break, Isaac approached her. "You ever think of going back?" he asked. Hannah stiffened slightly. Back? To help others leave. The idea hung between them. She had spent so long surviving that imagining return by choice felt strange. "At night," she admitted. "I think about it." Isaac nodded. Freedom grows when someone carries it backward. The thought rooted quietly. On the 89th day, riders appeared again. 2 this time. They did not charge, they did not shout. They approached slowly, official papers in hand. Reverend Cole met them at the road. Several men stood nearby, not aggressive, but present. Hannah and Ruth watched from a short distance. The riders read names aloud, descriptions. 2 large-built colored women, escaped from lawful ownership. The words fell flat against the cold air. Reverend Cole responded calmly, "We have no property here, only residence." The riders insisted, claimed reward, claimed law. Isaac stepped forward. "Law requires proof." Witnesses gathered, men and women willing to swear residency, employment, character. The riders grew frustrated. "You hiding stolen property," one snapped. Hannah stepped forward then. Every eye turned. "I ain't property," she said evenly. The rider's gaze hardened. "You match description. Lots of women built strong," she replied calmly. "You arresting all?" A few quiet chuckles rose behind her. The rider realized what he faced was not 2 isolated fugitives, but a united settlement prepared to resist through structure, not chaos. He lowered his papers slowly. "This ain't finished." Reverend Cole's voice remained steady. "Then return with lawful warrant." The riders left before dusk. Snow began falling that night, soft at first, then thick, covering road tracks completely. By morning, no sign remained of their visit. Hannah stood at the edge of the settlement, watching white blanket the world. "They came," Ruth said beside her. "And left," Hannah answered. "You think they'll be back? Maybe. But something had shifted. Before, hunters controlled the chase. Now they had to confront witnesses, records, organized defense. The settlement was no longer hiding, it was asserting. Days turned into over 100 since the escape. A quiet milestone, neither woman spoke aloud at first. One evening, Ruth sat near the fire and smiled faintly. 100 days, she said. Hannah looked up slowly. 100 days? Alone in forest, across rivers, through ravines, onto roads, into community. They had survived more than pursuit. They had survived doubt. That night, Hannah could not sleep. Isaac's words echoed. Freedom grows when someone carries it backward. She rose before dawn and stepped outside. Snow crunched under her boots. The air bit sharp. Reverend Cole stood near the meeting hall as if expecting her.
You thinking? He observed.
Yes, about going south. She nodded. Not to surrender, she clarified. To guide. He studied her carefully. It is dangerous. So was staying. He smiled faintly. You ain't built small. No, she agreed. In early spring, when snow melted and roads softened again, Hannah and Ruth prepared quietly. Not to flee. To return partway far enough to connect with whispers of others ready to run. The settlement did not try to stop them. Instead, it armed them with knowledge-safe routes, names of allies, coded phrases. Ruth tightened her boots the morning they left. We really doing this? She asked. Hannah looked north once more, the land that had given them room to stand. Then she looked south, the direction of chains. We ain't running now, she said. We walking back with purpose. They stepped onto the road together, not hunted, not hidden, carrying something heavier and stronger than fear. Behind them stood a community forged by resistance. Ahead of them waited others who believed escape impossible. The 50 bounty hunters who once chased them had failed not because they were outrun, but because the women they hunted refused to remain prey. And now those same women moved like quiet architects of change, carving paths through fear the same way rivers carve stone. Slow, persistent, unstoppable. The plantation bells would still ring somewhere far behind, but this time, when they echoed through fields, there would be ears listening differently, and feet preparing to move.